In 1938, a British aircraft designer walked into the Air Ministry with blueprints for a bomber that would revolutionize aerial warfare. Geoffrey de Havilland proposed an aircraft with no defensive guns, no metal skin, no crew of 10. Just 2 men, plywood, and speed. The committee looked at his drawings and laughed. Wood, in the age of all-metal aircraft? Preposterous. They rejected it outright. For years later, that same wooden aircraft would be terrorizing the Third Reich at speeds no German fighter could match, and Hermann Göring himself would publicly confess his envy of the machine the British called the Mosquito. But this story isn't just about an aircraft. It's about the terrible price of genius. Geoffrey de Havilland didn't come from aviation aristocracy. Born in 1882 in High Wycombe, the son of a rural clergyman, he grew up sketching mechanical devices in church notebooks while his father preached. At 21, he apprenticed at a bus company. Not airplanes, buses. But de Havilland had a peculiar gift. He could see air. Not literally, of course, but he possessed an intuitive understanding of how invisible forces moved around solid objects. While other young engineers memorized equations, de Havilland closed his eyes and visualized pressure gradients and boundary layers. He could feel lift. In 1908, he withdrew his life savings, 1,000 pounds, and locked himself in a workshop. His grandfather thought he'd gone mad. His young wife, Louie, worried they'd starve. But de Havilland built his first aircraft anyway, constructing it entirely himself. Engine, wings, fuselage, everything. On December 10th, 1909, he climbed into the pilot's seat for the first time. The aircraft lifted 8 feet off the ground, flew 70 yards, then nosedived into the earth and shattered into splinters. De Havilland crawled from the wreckage with a grin. "It flew," he said. "It actually flew." The crash taught him something the textbooks couldn't. What absorbed impact, metal crumpled and tore. What splintered but held together. The lesson stayed with him for 3 decades. By 1910, the British War Office noticed this peculiar engineer who kept crashing and rebuilding. They offered him a job. £2 a week to design aircraft for His Majesty's military. De Havilland accepted and quietly became one of Britain's most prolific aircraft designers. The DH-.2 fighter, the DH-.4 bomber, which Americans mass-produced by the thousands, the DH-.9, which flew more combat missions than any other British aircraft in World War I. But de Havilland never chased glory. He worked in back rooms, refining, iterating, improving. When journalists asked for interviews, he declined. When the Air Ministry offered medals, he accepted them quietly and returned to his drafting table. In 1920, he did something unusual for a brilliant engineer. He started his own company. The de Havilland Aircraft Company operated out of a small factory in Stag Lane, employing just 37 workers. While competitors built massive metal bombers and fighters, de Havilland focused on elegant civilian aircraft. The DH-.60 Moth became the Model T of aviation, the first aircraft middle-class flying clubs could afford. The DH-.88 Comet Racer won the England to Australia air race in 1934, covering 11,300 miles in just 71 hours. Fast, light, efficient. These were de Havilland's signatures. But by 1936, clouds gathered over Europe once again. Hitler rearmed. Mussolini invaded, and the British Air Ministry began preparing for the war everyone knew was coming. They issued specifications for new bombers, heavy, armored, bristling with gun turrets, capable of defending themselves against swarms of enemy fighters. Metal, power, firepower, the doctrine of the era demanded bombers fight their way to the target. De Havilland thought this was lunacy. He'd watched bomber formations crawl across the sky at 200 miles per hour, easy prey for nimble fighters. He'd seen the weight penalties of armor plating and gun turrets. Every pound of defensive armament was a pound not carrying bombs. Every gunner position was dead weight, drag, complexity. And for what? To shoot at fighters moving twice your speed? De Havilland ran the calculations. The answer was obvious. Don't fight the fighters. Outrun them. In October 1938, he submitted specification B.138 to the Air Ministry, an unarmed bomber reconnaissance aircraft built almost entirely of wood, powered by 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, carrying a crew of just 2, top speed, for 100 miles per hour. At that velocity, nothing flying could catch it. No armor needed. No gun turrets. No 5-ton defensive suite. Just speed, bombs, and a pilot who trusted physics. The Air Ministry response was withering. One official called it a designer's indulgence, wholly unsuitable for modern warfare. Another wrote that wooden construction belonged to the previous war, not the coming one. Metal represented progress. Strength, the industrial age. Wood was for furniture and toys. The committee cited strategic bombing doctrine, crew survivability studies, defensive firepower requirements. Page after page of reasoned rejection. De Havilland's proposal was declined, firmly, but Geoffrey de Havilland had spent his life savings building an aircraft before. He'd survived crashes, skepticism, and poverty. And he knew with the certainty that only comes from genuine understanding, that he was right and the experts were wrong. He went back to his factory and began building the aircraft anyway, without a contract, without ministry funding, on his own company's budget. He called it the DH.98. His team called it the Mosquito because it was small, fast, and would prove extremely annoying to the enemy. The decision to use what wasn't romantic nostalgia. It was cold engineering brilliance. Britain's aluminum supply was already stretched thin building Spitfires and Hurricanes. Wood was abundant. British furniture makers sat idle, their craftsmen unemployed. De Havilland could tap a labor force the metal aircraft factories couldn't touch. But not just any wood. De Havilland developed a composite material decades ahead of its time. Sandwich panels of balsa with core bonded between birch plywood skins using casein glue derived from milk protein. The result was lighter than aluminum, stronger than conventional plywood, and easy to repair in the field. You could patch a Mosquito with woodworking tools. The prototype took shape in secret. De Havilland's team worked through 1939 and into 1940, even as the Luftwaffe bombed Britain and the Air Ministry ordered more heavy metal bombers. On November 25, 1940, test pilot Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., the designer's eldest son, climbed into the yellow prototype at Hatfield Aerodrome. The twin Merlins roared to life. The wooden aircraft accelerated down a runway and lifted into gray English sky. It flew like a dream, smooth, responsive, fast. Faster than anything British pilots had ever experienced. During initial trials, Geoffrey Jr. pushed the Mosquito to 388 miles per hour straight and level, then 392. Then, in a shallow dive for 100 miles per hour, the Spitfire, Britain's premier fighter, topped out at 370. The Bf-109E, Germany's frontline fighter, managed 354. The Mosquito bomber was faster than the fighters meant to catch it. The Air Ministry suddenly found Geoffrey de Havilland's phone number. They ordered 50 aircraft immediately, then 200, then 500. Production ramped up through 1941 and 1942. De Havilland's gamble on would prove prophetic. Furniture factories across Britain and Canada converted to Mosquito production. Piano makers built wing spars. Cabinet shops assembled fuselages. By 1943, Mosquito production reached 100 aircraft per month without straining aluminum supplies. The Wooden Wonder became the only major Allied aircraft whose production never faced material shortages. But speed was just the beginning. The Mosquito could carry a bomb load that humiliated expectations. 4,000 pounds internally. Later variants managed 4,000 pounds internally plus 2,000 pounds on external racks. That matched the early model B-17 Flying Fortress, which required crew of 10 and 4 times the Mosquito's weight. 2 men in a wooden aircraft could deliver the same destruction as 10 men in a metal behemoth, arrive faster, and return home before the enemy knew they'd been hit. The operational versatility became almost absurd. The RAF configured Mosquitos as high-altitude bombers, low-level precision strike aircraft, night fighters bristling with radar and cannons, photo reconnaissance platforms, Pathfinder target markers, submarine hunters, and even high-speed transports for secret agents and diplomats. One Mosquito variant carried a 57mm cannon that could sink ships. Another hauled a 4,000-pound cookie bomb that leveled city blocks. No other aircraft in World War II served in so many roles. Bomber Command discovered something remarkable. Mosquito squadrons could attack Berlin in broad daylight with near-zero losses. Conventional heavy bombers suffered catastrophic casualties on Berlin raids. 5, 6, 7% losses per mission. Mosquitos went to Berlin and came back. Every single one. The Germans tried everything. Bf-109GS, FW-190s, the new Ta-152 high-altitude interceptor. Nothing worked. By the time German radar detected the Mosquitos crossing the coast, they'd already dropped their bombs and turned for home. The psychological impact was devastating. At a Luftwaffe conference in 1943, Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring exploded in frustration. His staff had just informed him that Mosquitos had bombed Berlin again in daylight, again without losses. Göring reportedly shouted, "It makes me furious when I see the Mosquito. I turn green and yellow with envy. The British, who can afford aluminum better than we can, knock together a beautiful wooden aircraft that every piano factory over there is building, and they give it a speed which they have now increased yet again. What do you make of that?" Coming from Hitler's second-in-command, from the man who built the Luftwaffe, this was an extraordinary confession. The architect of Blitzkrieg envied a wooden British bomber. The Mosquito compiled a record that still staggers: 39,795 operational sorties. Just 254 aircraft lost to all causes, a loss rate of 0.63%, the lowest of any Allied bomber. For comparison, B-17 suffered nearly 6% losses. Lancaster's nearly 4%. The Mosquito was 30 times safer than heavy bombers, while delivering comparable destruction with a tenth the crew. No defensive guns. No armor. Just aerodynamics and 2 Merlin engines screaming at 3,000 revolutions per minute. Some missions entered legend. On January 30th, 1943, Mosquitos attacked Berlin in broad daylight during a scheduled radio broadcast by Göring commemorating the Nazis' rise to power. The air raid sirens interrupted Göring mid-speech. 90 million Germans listening to their radios heard the broadcast suddenly terminate. The humiliation was exquisite. In February 1944, a precision Mosquito raid breached the walls of Amiens prison in occupied France, allowing resistance fighters to escape. The bombers struck the prison walls from just 50 feet altitude, dropped their bombs with surgical precision, and vanished before German fighters could scramble. 158 prisoners escaped. It was the most precise bombing raid of the war. But the Mosquito's greatest contribution might have been strategic, forcing Germany to keep fighters and anti-aircraft guns defending the homeland instead of deploying them to combat theaters. Every night fighters scrambled to chase Mosquitos over Berlin was a fighter not shooting down Soviet bombers over the Eastern Front. Every 88mm gun protecting Munich was a gun not killing Allied tanks in Normandy. The Mosquito tied down German resources far beyond its physical damage. By war's end, de Havilland had produced 7,781 Mosquitos in 16 major variants. The aircraft served with the RAF, Royal Canadian Air Force, USAF, Royal Australian Air Force, and a dozen other Allied nations. It flew combat missions on every front: Western Europe, North Africa, the Mediterranean, Burma, the Pacific. Some Mosquitos continued military service into the 1950s, outlasting jets that were supposed to render them obsolete. Geoffrey de Havilland should have retired as Britain's most celebrated aircraft designer. He'd proven the experts wrong. He'd changed doctrine. He'd saved thousands of air crews from death by making defense obsolete. But while he celebrated the Mosquitos' triumph, tragedy stalked his family with cruel precision. Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., the test pilot who first flew the Mosquito prototype, had inherited his father's brilliance and daring. After the war, he became de Havilland's chief test pilot, taking the company's experimental jets to their limits. On September 27, 1946, Geoffrey Jr. climbed into the DH.108 Swallow, a radical tailless jet designed to break the sound barrier. He took off from Hatfield, accelerated to maximum speed over the Thames estuary, and pushed the aircraft into a shallow dive. Witnesses on the ground heard a sound like thunder. The DH.108 disintegrated in midair. Pieces rained into the estuary. Geoffrey Jr. was 36 years old. Search crews recovered his body days later. The aircraft's wreckage told the story. He'd encountered a phenomenon engineers would later call Mach Tuck, a catastrophic loss of control as aircraft approached the speed of sound. Geoffrey Jr. never knew what killed him. The DH.108 just came apart around him at 6,000 feet. Geoffrey de Havilland buried his eldest son and returned to work. What else could he do? Stop designing? Stop testing? Geoffrey Jr. had died pushing the boundaries of flight, exactly as his father had done for 4 decades. It was a family trade, but the price wasn't finished. John de Havilland, the younger son, was also a pilot. In 1943, during the war, John served with Mosquito Night Fighter Squadron. On August 3, 1943, his Mosquito developed engine trouble over southern England. John attempted an emergency landing. The aircraft struck trees, cartwheeled, and crashed into woods near Hatfield. John was 24. His father reached the crash site and pulled his son's body from the wreckage. 2 sons, both pilots, both killed in the Havilland aircraft, both testing the limits of their father's designs. The question that haunted Geoffrey de Havilland for the rest of his life was never spoken publicly. But everyone who knew him saw in his eyes. Was the innovation worth the price? Should he have stopped designing? Should he have forbidden his sons from flying? Could a father who built faster, more dangerous aircraft claim surprise when those aircraft killed the people he loved most? De Havilland never stopped working. The DH.106 Comet became the world's first commercial jet airliner in 1952. The DH.110C Vixen became the Royal Navy's premier carrier fighter. He continued designing until his retirement, producing more than 50 distinct aircraft types across 6 decades. But colleagues noticed a change. The man who once smiled easily now retreated into quiet contemplation. He rarely spoke about his sons. When asked about John or Geoffrey Jr., he'd offer brief, factual responses and change the subject. In 1960, Queen Elizabeth II knighted him, Sir Geoffrey de Havilland. The honor recognized a lifetime of contribution to British aviation and industry. De Havilland attended the ceremony, accepted the knighthood with characteristic modesty, and went home to Hertfordshire. He gave almost no interviews. When aviation historians asked to write his biography, he politely declined. He didn't want celebration. He just wanted to design one more aircraft, one more improvement, one more solution to the puzzle of flight. Geoffrey de Havilland died on May 21, 1965, at his home in Watford. He was 82. Obituaries praised his genius, his innovations, his impact on British aviation. They noted his wooden bomber that outfought the Luftwaffe. They mentioned the Comet jet. They listed his medals and honors. Some mentioned his sons. None asked a question that surely consumed his final years: whether genius justifies a sacrifice it demands from those who possess it and those who love them. The Mosquito remained in service until 1963, nearly 20 years after the war ended. Some found civilian second lives as racing aircraft and aerial survey platforms. A handful survive in museums, their plywood skins carefully preserved behind climate-controlled glass. Visitors marvel at how something so simple, wooden glue and aerodynamic understanding, could dominate the sky. They read the placards describing the Mosquito speed, its bomb load, its missions. They see the statistics. 39,795 sorties, 0.63% loss rate. Hitler's nightmare. What they don't see is the cost calculated in a different currency. Two sons who trusted their father's designs. A father who built machines faster and more dangerous than the previous generation, knowing his children would fly them. A family that paid the price of innovation, not in money or time, but in blood and grief. Was the Mosquito worth it? Ask the bomber crews who survived the war, because they flew an aircraft too fast to catch. Ask the French resistance fighters who escaped Amiens prison, because mosquitoes breached the walls. Ask the German commanders who couldn't stop plywood bombers from striking Berlin in daylight. The answer depends entirely on what you're willing to sacrifice for progress. Geoffrey de Havilland believed flight was humanity's destiny. He spent 6 decades making aircraft lighter, faster, more elegant. He trusted wood when the world demanded metal. He pursued speed when doctrine demanded armor. He was right about almost everything. But standing over his sons' graves, watching them lower into English earth, he must have wondered whether being right justified the price. The aircraft designer who revolutionized aerial warfare without ever seeking fame. The father who built his sons' coffins from the same material that saved thousands of lives. The genius who changed military doctrine but couldn't save the people he loved most. Innovation demands sacrifice. We just rarely discuss who makes that sacrifice and whether they had a choice.